Hello, beautiful people, and a warm welcome to the Surrey Art School studio for this, our first cycle of the winter season and our new theme, A Winter's Tale. Now, I'm really loving the sort of breadth of this theme for us, and ever since I first came up with it, I've found that I have had just all these images swimming around in my head, sort of images of these sort of spirits of these animals, and then also these very wintry, cold landscapes, places where there is very little light, and thinking in my mind, or sort of imagining in my mind, how we can sort of celebrate the light and welcome it back slowly but surely into the pages of our sketchbook. Now, we're working with sort of fragments here. We're working with fragments of myth and folklore. And in this first episode, we're looking at this idea or this notion of the dear mother. Now, I was inspired by this by the winter solstice, because the winter solstice is a time when in many different sort of northern territories, this spirit of the deer, or the deer, would have been part of celebrations of the returning light. But what we really have when we look at sort of ancient folklore like this is sort of a series of fragments of little pieces of stories. So in one story, the deer might feature as a sort of helpful spirit in the journey to go back and collect the light and bring it home. And in other stories, it might be the deer itself, which is sort of the main character, if that makes sense. And in other cultures, it may simply be a celebration of the deer as a provider of nourishment, as a provider of sort of food and shelter during the really dark winter months. So we begin, in a way, with sort of just the bare bones of a story, what has survived on sort of standing stones, what has survived in relics and in archeological digs. And there is no real clear set story that we can work from here. And in some ways, maybe that's a little bit disorientating. But in other ways, maybe that just means that we are able to become the authors of this story, that we can sort of take these fragments. And this is what I'm working with really for this season, taking these fragments of ideas, of little bits of stories and folklore, and sort of stitching them back together with love in our own way. So the idea for this whole winter season is to look at these fragments of stories from folklore, look at these fragments from sort of archaeological digs, and to come up with our own story really about how we sort of celebrate that returning light from the darkest day on the winter solstice. So there may be animal spirits involved, there may be wintry landscapes involved, well, there most certainly will be. And I wanted to give you guys the opportunity to choose which elements that I offer up you might like to weave into your own story by the end of this project. So a little bit different to the way I might have taught some of my other projects. I want to leave it really open-ended. And I love already some of the things that I've seen from some of you guys that have been making title pages about this. Because it's really interesting to see what is already swimming in our imagination. So before you even start this cycle, you may want to sit down, just make a few notes about sort of what that title, A Winter's Tale, sort of evokes in your mind. And from just some of the imagery that I've offered up already, how a story is already being painted in the sort of screen of your mind, and what elements might be included in that. Because I'm sort of a creative guide, and I will offer little sort of starting points and little tasters and little parts of my own interpretation of this winter's tale. But I really, really welcome you to weave in your own too, to do your own research, to look up stories that sort of resonate with you, to share them with the community, to share any other sort of ideas and insights that come to you based around this overall theme and this idea of inviting the light back into our lives. So there's plenty of opportunities for you to put your own stamp on this project this season. That's what I'm trying to say. So I've begun with bones. I've begun with the bare bones of some deer. And I thought this was a really nice place to start as we start to unearth these stories of the deer and decide which elements we choose to sort of work with, which fragments we would like to sort of darn and mend and include in our story. So we're starting really simply just with some chalk and charcoal. I worked with just some black sugar paper, and I've taken some nice photos of some skulls and some bones, and I'm going to invite you to create some studies of those skulls and bones during this cycle. And then at the end of the cycle, I offer up a very, very simplified way of recording a deer's head. And then I offer up a slightly more realistic reindeer study, again, just in chalk and charcoal. So all you need is a chunk of chalk, a charcoal pencil. A chalk and charcoal pencil would be useful, and maybe a blender, but you can also just use your finger for blending. And if you don't have any black sugar paper, we have sent out just some samples of some black paper. If you want to work on a slightly smaller scale, you can use those. Or in the resources, I've also included the option to just get some black ink, create a box of darkness in your sketchbooks, and then start to invite some light into that page. So very, very simple for this first cycle of the season. We will get into more technical stuff as we go along, and I'll come back to you at the end of this cycle and just give some suggestions of what materials you might need. But to begin with, I hope you enjoy this sort of very gentle dance with dark and light, which I'm offering up for this first cycle of the season. Just a chance to sort of tune into the spirit of the deer and a chance to begin to play with light and dark. So this box of darkness that I'm offering to you, I'm asking you to just fill it with some light for this first cycle of the season. And I'll be back at the end of this episode, as I said, to offer up a few suggestions about what you might need for cycle 2. But I really hope you enjoy this gentle easing into the theme today, and I really do encourage you to make some of your own notes as well, do some of your own research as you start to tune into this energy, this idea of the dear mother. So much love. Okay, my loves, let's make a start on this winter season theme. I just wanted to take a moment just for people that might be new to Sketchbook Club, just to very quickly talk through some of the things that we've sent you in your subscription box. And if you don't have the subscription box, please don't worry. You can work with the paints and the colours and the surfaces that you've got at home. The idea behind the subscription box is just to give some little starting points, some things that you might find useful or inspiring for the project ahead. So first of all, we sent you a little postcard, and that's just got a little bit of information about what we're going to be covering through the theme. And this Winter's Tale really is about a journey from dark to light, and that is reflected in some of the stuff that we've sent you. It's also reflected in some of the creative exercises that we're going to be doing. So we begin with a box of darkness. We begin in our minds at the winter solstice, at that tipping point, at that darkest day of the year. And then through our creative investigations, we're going to be inviting that light back in really, really gently. So do have a look at the postcard. It's got a little bit of information on it, a little bit about oral traditions and storytelling as well, which is really going to play into this. Because when we look at stories that have been passed down orally, what we end up with is just the bare bones of a story. And the invitation this season is to flesh out that story and make it your own. So we'll use some myth, we'll use some folklore as inspiration. There's going to be lots of options along the way for you to choose to include or not include different elements, different creative elements that I'm going to offer up to you. And everything is just an offering. You can choose whether or not to accept or not. So We've sent you out some samples of paper. We always like to send out just some little bits of watercolour paper and other surfaces. So you've got some blue tint watercolour paper. You've also got a couple of sheets of black watercolour paper. You may find those useful in the next exercise, or some black paper to work in, okay? And the other ones just to play with, really, just for sampling. Stick them in your sketchbook, and when we're doing some of the exercises, you might want to try using those surfaces and seeing how things like the paints behave differently on those. And then following that theme of dark and light, in our paints that we've chosen for this season, we've got Payne's Blue Grey and Indigo. Those are our dark colours. They're going to be our background tones. They're going to be our sort of deep, cold, wintry skies. And then we've also got some light elements in there as well. So we've got iridescent gold and we've got pearlescent shimmer. Those are going to be our sort of light elements that we're going to work over the top later on in the season. And then finally, we've got some Burnt Tiger's Eye Genuine. That is just for technically painting some of the aspects that we're going to be painting. So again, you don't have to have these colours, but if you've got something similar at home, it's going to be useful to you. And just a reminder that those paint colours are actually sort of slotted behind the paint colours as a list that tells you what the colours are, okay? So you've got a sample here, and you may have to pick up some more along the way, or just work with what you've got at home. And then finally, just want to talk about these really quickly. We sent you some black carbon paper and we've sent you some white carbon paper, and all through this I'll be sending out resources that you can print, and if you're struggling with the drawn elements, just use these. As in, if, say for example, there's a deer head and you're struggling with the drawing of it, just take the image from the resources, get some white carbon paper or some black carbon paper, place it on, and then you can trace it over the top, at least to get the skeleton or the bare bones of that drawing down. So I don't want you to feel intimidated if you don't think your drawing skills are up to scratch here. This is not just about drawing, although I will be including a drawn element today. This is about imagination, and it's about creating sort of landscapes using imagination, using that visual vocabulary of the folk tales. And just trust me that I'm going to guide you as we move through this process. So we are going to begin with the bones. We're going to begin with the bare bones of this project. We're working with the bare bones of some myth and folklore. And sort of we're going to build up and flesh out, as I said before, from that basic skeleton. So we're going to work actually by starting by doing some bone drawings. So what you're going to need is a dark surface to work on. So that can either be, you can just use the little samples that we've got here of black paper, or I've cut up some black sugar paper, which is about the size of my square sketchbook, and I'm going to work on that. But also equally, you could just get some black ink, like I've done here, I don't know if you can see, and just create a dark surface on your sketchbook that you can work on for this next part of the cycle. And then you're just going to need some chalk and a charcoal pencil. Yeah, that's it, some chalk and a charcoal pencil. So let's get stuck in, shall we? Let's make a start on this beautiful new theme. I'll meet you back here. Just make sure you've got some dark paper, a dark surface to work on, and some chalk and charcoal, and we'll go from there, okay? Okay, my loves, let's make a start then. So as you can see, I've brought some sort of simple bones from my collection along, and we're just going to do some sort of quick explorations of light and dark using these bones as a sort of starting point. So I'm going to start with just a chunky piece of charcoal, and I really want to just sort of establish the light wherever I can see it first. So those lightest areas. And then I've got a charcoal and I've got a chalk pencil, and we'll work into these little bone drawings and add some detail using those, okay? So start with some simple bone shapes. We're going to start with this one up here. And you can really see, because the light is so beautiful today, you can really see the highlight, the lightest point of that bone. You can see the midtones and you can see the shadow cast. So it makes it really, really easy with that light for us to start to build up a study of these bones. So I'm just going to find those basic shapes that I can see to begin with on this. This is just some black sugar paper, and I'm using like the square edge of my chalk here. So the side of the chalk, just to sort of chunk that in to begin with. And then there's sort of like, so sort of little nodules here. And then there's another little nodule here on the end, on the edge of this little skeleton. And then just some sort of finer lines here. So I'm going to pop those in. So that's just like the basic shape. Rub it into the paper. So what we're doing here is we're pushing it into the tooth of the paper. We know we've done a fair bit of chalk and charcoal before, but for those of you that are with us for the first time, pushing that into the tooth of the paper, getting rid of that sort of smudginess, and just sort of establishing the bare bones of that shape. There we go. Give it a blow to get rid of the excess, and then we can start to work in some of the details. So I've actually put some light down there that doesn't exist, so let's sort that out first. So actually now I've sort of got this edge of the bone here, I can start to pull in some shadow with my charcoal pencil and start to eliminate, maybe using the side to begin with, because we just want to get some chunky shapes in. Just sort of eliminate some areas. And again, when we're doing this sort of blocky work, we can just smudge with our fingers. If you have got a blender, then you can bring that in a little bit later on. But look, I can see exactly like the edge of that shadow there. And I just want to sort of mimic that. So it's a little bit flatter than what I'd thought before. Just want to mimic that with the shadow. So everything we do in art is a dance of light and shadow. This is where you might need a slightly more specific blender. If you don't have one of these, just roll up a piece of kitchen towel and use that. It works just as well. We're sort of starting to find the edge of where that shadow wraps around the light. And again, similarly here, you can start to see some little tonal areas. There's a sort of band of dark just here at the base of that bone. I'm going to pull that in and accentuate it. And the nice thing about working with chalk and charcoal is there's a bit of a push and pull. So you can sort of add an area of dark, have a look at your drawing, and if you're not happy with it, you can push it back again. So say, for example, I add this and then I decide, oh, it's a little bit, I've gone a little bit too far into the bone there. I can just come along with my charcoal and push it back again. This is what I mean by push and pull. Okay. So all through this project, all through the sort of preparations for this project, I've had these images of these sort of white, ghostly animals in these stark, cold landscapes. And that's sort of what I'm aiming towards getting you to in terms of your work in your sketchbook. But I realised that it's helpful to start with a foundation, almost like my brain had jumped to the end of the project without thinking about what was happening at the beginning. Can you see now when we start to add that shadow to the light, and even when we just use like little bits of tone that are left over on the end of our blender, how we start to get this sense of form coming through. So added that little shadow there. I can sort of eat into this little break here with my charcoal. And sort of we can start to cut in and away at that whole shape that I created as well. So if you can see here where the shadow cuts in, we're just going to do exactly the same thing with adding some dark to this area and reshaping that area of the bone. So sort of getting this foundation sort of shapes in first, and then we can start to look at sort of more of the fine detail on the bones as well. So lots of like little dints in the cartilage, which are quite interesting, but you can see that fairly quickly using this process, sort of starting with the light and then gradually adding in and blending off areas of shadow, we're starting to get something quite quickly that begins to look like a study of a bone. This is why I like working in this way. And again, like I said, all the time you can sort of reshape the light areas by using a little bit of shade or a little bit of shadow. So I can flatten the top of that area there, which I went a little bit too heavy on, blend off. So we're starting with some bones like this, but we're also going to look at some deer skulls. So I just wanted to show you the basic technique using a very simple bone. And I will provide lots of images in the resources here, so if you want to have a go at some of the other bones, you are more than welcome to. This is just like a basic bone shape that we're building up here. So once we've got that sort of foundation down, you may even want to think about, I'm actually going to get rid of the rest of that white because I don't need it. Doesn't exist. The figment of my imagination there. There we go. It's that sort of adding and deleting and like that dance of light and shadow that I love about this way of working. And just blend that in and it just completely disappears, and that's very, very satisfying. Okay, so once we've got that like foundation layer down, you might even want to just use something like a pastel spray just to fix it so that it doesn't move too much before you start to add those later layers. In fact, I'm just going to do that real quickly now. A real light misting. Okay, and then when we get into this finer detail, we're looking a little bit closer at the bone. Can you see there's all these little bits of sort of light and dark and cartilage here, and on the main bit of the bone as well, there's like little dints, there's little variations. There's actually a little bit of like, it almost looks like it's been sawn off there, and even here underneath in the shadow area, I don't know if you can see it, but there's lots and lots of texture. So we're just going to add a little bit of that texture now, just to sort of spice up this drawing a little bit. So over here especially, I can see lots of little bits of texture. So I'm just sort of scribbling in that area to sort of bring it to life. And you can accentuate the area around it as well. So bump up the light here and it actually accentuates the textured area that is alongside it. I'm just adding some like little dots, or maybe just some little areas of shadow. So there's a little bit of shadow there, a little bit of shadow there, and blending that back in. And starting to get the sense of some of that texture and surface on the bone. And again here as well, there's some like little areas of line. There's a little curve that needs to be completed there. That's better. Bringing in a little bit more light into that shadow area. Lots of texture here, so let's build that up. That sort of starts to show you what's hidden in that deep dark shadow below. And just sort of little hints of some of that pigmentation on the bone now. And even if you want to crisp up this side of the bone, if you just add a little bit more black, then that'll start to make it pop. So this is like dance of light and shadow here. So just having a play with chalk and charcoal, starting off with just that soft layer of sort of soft tones of the black and white, and now just adding a little bit more texture with our sharp pencil just to sort of bring that to life, and just a nice little exercise in light and shadow in observing which areas are sort of sitting in darkness, which areas are the brightest, and then how we can just play around or toy with that sort of light and shadow in order to create a sort of bona fide study, shall we say. And if I put just a little bit of shadow just beneath our object as well, that sort of starts to bring it to life. The Sketchbook Club is a drawing class, yes. It's also very imaginative this season, but I wanted to start with a little bit of drawing because it just felt right for this cycle, just for this sort of easing in. So there we go, there's a bone. Quite like to do a little jaw now, because I think it's quite interesting for starting to look at the structure of deer, their heads, their teeth. So we'll do that one real quickly, and I'll just show you the basics of it, which is just, again, finding that whole shape using the side of your chalk, finding those core sort of shapes of like the jawbone, and that sort of, that basic shape, rubbing to push it in. We get some tones coming through here from the paper underneath as well, which is quite nice. So there's my basic jawbone. Sorry for the blown, but I need to get rid of that extra dust. There's my basic jawbone, or the basic light areas of the jawbone. And then even the teeth, we can push those out using just the side of our chalk. So all sort of wonky and a bit misshapen, a bit like my teeth. And this is all just light so far, which is really quite nice. And then we can start to put some of the shadow areas in. So like the little gaps between the teeth, this little area, adding a bit of shadow just to the area underneath the teeth and the gaps between the teeth here. And so very quickly you can build up quite a sense of a detailed study just using these two materials. So again, I can see sort of a little bit of shadow cutting off this area here, which I can work in and then blend. And then sort of a little bit of shadow creeping in between those teeth. And then getting right to the edges, those sharp edges, we can do really nicely with this charcoal pencil, and even start to find that bottom edge of this little jawbone. So quite quickly we can get this sense of these little sharp teeth just by cutting away at the white that we've already added. I don't want to go into too much detail here, but do want to make you feel confident about what you're doing as well. So bump up this area here as it blends in. Add a little bit more here at the top. And once we've got those sort of core shapes in, starting to reshape that a little bit using the black. And maybe add in a little bit more sort of scratchy tone to those bones. So you can choose which bones you draw. I think it's really satisfying to do the jaw, and I think it's very satisfying just to do the basic bone shape, these bare bones of deer. And then we're going to have a go at doing just a deer skull in the next part. Just getting rid of all my excess again. And again, this sort of finishing touches is just to sharpen up some of those edges. So I can come in with my white here. Where I've actually gone black, there is a highlight sticking up here. There's actually a fair old highlight here as well. So just bumping up now, adding any other extra little highlights that I can see. And actually this base bit of the bone sort of sits in shadow. So if I just pull my charcoal pencil sideways along there, I can start to find that shadow area. So you could go on and on and on and on and on now. We're playing around with adding like little details to the teeth and things like that. But some good solid studies to begin with, I think, just some bare bone studies that hopefully will lead us into a better understanding of the deer or the reindeer when we start to have a go at drawing them. So just that foundation skills to begin with, okay? So I'm just going to pause, reset, and then we're going to have a look at a whole skull. So you'll need another sheet of paper about this size. I'm going to have a little bit of fun with these antlers as well, because those are definitely something that are going to feed into the rest of the project too. So just a quick reset, and then I'll meet you back here with a fresh sheet of paper, and we'll just have a look at one last subject, this deer skull, okay? Gosh, I'm so grateful for the light today. It's absolutely perfect for this exercise after lots of dark, gloomy days. Okay, so this is a whole deer skull that I've had in the studio for some time, and I just thinking about the spirit of the deer mother and this bare bones of the story and sort of how we build up that story, because we have a choice in how we build up that story, and I want to offer you that choice this season. I thought it'd be really interesting to look at what's happening beneath the flesh, at the bones below, before we start to look at some actual images of deer heads. And I also love the fact that we've got these antlers here, because we're going to be looking at antlers a little bit later on as well. So with this deer, I'll try and get it just about in shot. With this deer skull, I'll try and get it just about in shot. Again, we're going to start with just the main headlines. Forgive the pun. So what we want is to get that sort of I'm just using the side, oh, it's gone really bendy. So use the side of my chalk again and just finding that shape at the back of the head. I'm not going to get into the technicals of what that's called. And then that sort of space over the eye socket. I love doing this leading with the light. It's so much easier than working on a white sheet of paper, which was really creeping me out for this season. So start in this box of darkness and build the light in, celebrate that returning light. So I'm just pulling my chalk across. I've made that sort of eye for the socket. Maybe it's a little bit too small, but I can always make it bigger, can't I? And I'm just putting in the main, again, headlines of light, finding that shape over the sort of top jaw, leaving a little space for that crack. Might as well, no point in putting it in and then having to take it away again, and just leaving things really sharp at the edges here. So just pulling some little lines across the edges. This all sits in shadow, so that's a lot easier. This can come down probably a little bit further. So again, we're playing with that sort of push and pull here, and we can definitely pull out some of those teeth. Again, just using the side of the chalk, pulling out those toothy shapes. We can always fill them in afterwards. Let's leave a little gap there because there was a gap. And then coming off this eye socket is the beginnings of that antler. I may not fit it all in. I'm okay with that. So we want nice, sharp area of white there. And then again, for the antler itself, just use your chalk on its side and just sort of lighten your pressure as you go. And you should be able to create that sort of twirling, swirling shape of the antler. Doesn't matter if it doesn't look perfect just yet, okay? I could probably go off onto my other sheet of paper, to be honest. I'm not very good at drawing small. You will know this if you've been following me for a while. Now we blend. And you don't have to blend everywhere, but you're just pushing into the tooth of the paper some of those main headlines that you've put in. I've left that little knobbly bit because we'll do that differently. Push, smooth as we go along. And it's okay if these go into like double pages in your sketchbook. It's quite nice to have these studies, I think, at the beginning. And if you're looking at this thinking it's really hard, I promise you it's so much easier than it actually looks. It looks fancy, but it's not actually that difficult. So I'm just taking a little bit of my remnant white just to put something in that area below that sits in shadow, because there is some light there, it's just not very strong. And again, working my way around the edge of that socket. So that's my light. Quick blow. And now we can start to work in the shadow. So let's look at that socket and let's bring it out a little bit so it's the right size. Let's reshape it now. Pull it up. And then down and across. I promise we're not going to be doing super detailed deer for the whole season. We're doing this sort of spirit of the deer studies. But this is a nice little exercise to begin with. And then leaving a little gap for the highlight and then working in that shape of the shadow that I can see underneath. And just blocking that in quite loosely for now. And again, smudging it off. We can smudge off the inside of this socket as well. And, you know, using that shadow to help us find or define those light areas, okay? A little bit of a wrap around of that shadow here. And then again, just at the top here, slightly harder for you to see, there is like another rim with a little bit of shadow here. And again, we can sort of scruffle this area here where we can see. And we can use this charcoal pencil to cut back in and find some of that texture at the end of this skull. And again, like we did before with the teeth, we can cut back into the teeth, make them a little bit sharper, add that little bit of shadow tone or enhance that shadow tone between the teeth. There's this like wibbly wobbly shape at the bottom here that connects those teeth to the bone. They are still connected miraculously. So this is that ghost of the spirit of the deer, the bare bones, the skeleton of this deer spirit, this deer mother. You're going to need a little bit of white inside the socket. Just dibble a little bit on and then rub it in. You don't want it really light, you just want it a little bit lighter. And then you can start to dibble in some areas of texture and maybe even some sort of sharper areas of light where you can see them. I think if we're going to start with drawing, this is like the easiest version of drawing that I could come up with, just to get some drawing in our sketchbooks at the beginning without it being too taxing. So again, we can use this black to reshape. We can also, oh, there's a little bit of shadow. Can you see there? There's a little bit of shadow there, so we can work that in. And again, when you work it in, it's showing you the shape, it's showing you the form. Blend it off so it's not too strong. And again, you can do a lot of this sort of blending work just using whatever's on the tip of your blender and working that in. And then for this bit here, this little knobbly bit, I'm going to go in with my white and just add these sort of circular shapes. So that's all the light in, and then go in with my black and add the shadow in between. So these are quite stark drawings, just showing that texture of that little knobbly bit. And then again, I can sort of use that black to reshape this antler so that it goes off in the direction that I want it to. Perhaps pulling down a little bit of tone at that divot point. Yeah. And adding, again, a little bit of shadow on the base there. Amazing once you just add that light and then that shadow, how the drawing really starts to pop. And if you're not liking the look of your drawing, by the way, just take a photo of it. It'll flatten off the drawing and you'll suddenly start to be able to see it how it's meant to be, or how everyone else can see it rather than how you see it, if that makes sense. I hope it does. So taking a photo or looking at your picture in the mirror is going to help loads here. Okay, I'm not going to go too much further into this, but there are, like, if you look at the photograph, like finishing touches would be to add some of these little cracks that I can see. Sort of cracks in the structure, cracks in the surface. There's a little crack that sort of runs across the back of the skull here as well. So there's little finer details at the end will really make this drawing pop. But you don't need to go too crazy with it. The whole idea is just to familiarise yourself with the shape of a deer skull, to sort of connect to the spirit of the deer, like as if we are archaeologists and we're sort of unearthing her story, like digging up her story, and taking those bare bones, as I said before, and starting to flesh them out with some of the other creative activities that we do as we go along. So I'm going to leave that one there. That is more than enough for this cycle. Just a chance to explore and play with some very simple materials, looking at bones and skulls and considering the sort of bare bones of this story and where we might want to take it on this journey. And it may be that at some point later in the season, you bring these skulls back in. It's completely up to you if you want to do that, and that will make more sense as well as we move through this journey. But just want to start there with something simple, something bare bones, something that you can sink your teeth into, that will start to get you engaging with this spirit of this dear mother and the sort of bare bones of her story. Okay. Okay, so here we are back at that sort of delightful box full of darkness. So this is just my sketchbook, and this is a little layer that I put down which has just got some black drawing ink. I think this is Indian ink actually, so it's a little bit less likely to move, which is good, but any old black drawing ink will do. This one just comes out a little bit more matte. And then on the right hand side, the left hand side, because I don't know my left from my right, I've got some black sugar paper, which is exactly what I was working on before. Things like paint on noir would work fine for this, or if you just want to use some of those little black samples that we sent you, the black watercolour paper, that will also work really well. So any of those will do. And just to say as well, technically, if you're working with these square sketchbooks, you will find that at the beginning of the sketchbook, the left-hand side sort of flops down. So what I've done is I've just put my mushroom book underneath it, highly technical, just to prop it up, and it just gives me a hard surface to work on, which is really quite nice. So it's just that sort of balancing it out when you've started a new sketchbook and there's so much space to go, just to make sure that you have an even surface to work on. And then what I've got here is I've got some images which you are welcome to print off and work from, of some reindeer, because we haven't looked at the reindeer yet, and also a stag, but with some antlers. And this is what I've been talking about, sort of trying to get you into the brain frame of for this project, is there are loads of options here. So you don't necessarily have to draw a reindeer, even though that is in one of the stories. It doesn't have to be a reindeer. It could just be a regular deer, okay? So something like this. You also do not have to have a reindeer with antlers this size. You could work on some slightly larger antlers. And then again, I've got an image of a stag here, but I'm going to simplify this stag, and I think you'll like the way I do that. So it could be any deer, that is the point. And when we've got this sort of bare bones of a story, these sort of fragments of a story, some where it's about a goddess, some about where it's a deer and it's a mushroom and she flies, or somewhere it's a deer and they've got this sort of tree of life growing out of their antlers. It gives us these options, and you'll get to choose as we go along which elements you keep and which elements you decide not to. So just one for those of you that are feeling a bit less confident with drawing, or if you really want to simplify these deer, because what I did before could be seen as a little bit complex. Remember I said you've got your white carbon paper. And with this inky surface especially, which is quite flat, it's quite a nice invitation to sort of just get the outline down, especially if you're not super confident with drawing. But also if you want to simplify the deer and make it into a more of a folk style, this works really well as well. So what I'm going to do is put my sort of antlered deer on here, sort of maybe a little bit lower down. I'm going to put my white carbon paper underneath. And as I said before, the invitation here is to play. So actually I'm going to put it landscape because those antlers are quite wide. Bring the image down a little bit to about here. And the carbon paper is here to help you play and explore without getting too bogged down in the technicals of drawing. And we'll probably use it a little bit later on in the project as well to overlay some of our own drawings onto some backgrounds. But we'll come to that in a little while. So all I need now is a pencil, which I'm just going to grab. Okay, so I've got my white carbon paper down on my inky background here. This is the easiest way to make a dark background is with this black ink. And then I'm going to overlay this image of the stag over the top of that white carbon paper. And I'm just, again, going to put in the headlines here. So when I say headlines, I'm just going to press down and make sure I'm printing onto the right side. And I'm going to find just that basic outline shape of the deer's head and the ears. And just the sort of top of the head. And then I'm just going to run my pencil sort of down the middle of these lines so that I can flesh them out myself. But I just get a sense of the pattern of them. Again, that will make more sense when I show it to you, but I'm just going to very, very roughly run my pencil over those lines. And maybe I'll even add to this a little bit. I'm not sure yet. So what happens is I just peel it off very gently. That basic outline of the deer's head, maybe a little bit too low, but that's okay. That basic outline of the deer's head is down, and we get sort of the shape and pattern of the antlers, which I really quite like. And then we just go back to our charcoal pencil here. And we just start to block in. So here I'm just sort of aiming for more of a folk style, which is like a really pared back version of this deer. So I'm going to leave a little bit of a gap here between the face, maybe make it a little bit more pointy because that just feels right. And then add a little bit more white. So just make sure you leave a little bit of space so that we can define the the face from the rest of the head. Looks a bit goatee at the moment, that's okay. I'm going to loosely block in the ears as well. So this is creating like a sort of floaty deer spirit in quite a quick way. And then for the antlers, we can have loads of fun here. So if you press quite hard with your charcoal pencil, not so hard that you split it. If you press fairly hard with your charcoal pencil, you'll get a chunky line. And you'll be able to start to flesh out. It's actually all right if your charcoal pencil's a little bit blunt here. You can start to flesh out the shape of those antlers. Isn't that satisfying? And not only that, but you don't have to stick to exactly what's there. You can add to it, which is really quite enjoyable to do. So can you see how we're getting that spirit of the deer? And potentially even like this could be the deer mother with her tree of life sort of horns starting to take shape here. And you can have so much fun with this. We're just sort of carrying on, branching out and creating this illusion of this sort of tree of life growing out of the deer's antlers. And it just sort of skips a step and moves us into sort of more of an illustrational quality, shall we say, in terms of what we're doing. And you don't necessarily have to just use your charcoal pencil here either. You can bring in other elements. So you could, for example, load up some white gouache onto a brush and sort of add in some leaves. Or you could sort of doodle in using a white gel pen, one that works preferably. You could sort of doodle in some leaves using a white gel pen, which is really quite fun to do. Or start to add maybe some little patterns and shapes, you know. And sort of start to build up something which is a little bit more illustrative, but just using that sort of outline of the deer as a sort of starting point, I suppose. So my sort of intention here is to encourage you to play, but also to encourage you to simplify as you're sort of working some light into this dark space, but also just to have like a little bit of fun with this, you know, to be playful with it in a way that you might have done with your art when you're a kid, you know? Not aiming for perfection, but just sort of using this sketchbook space as a place where you can play and explore. I think my chalk pencil definitely needs a little bit of love now, but it's just about sort of taking some of those fragments of the story or the ways in which deer have been represented in myth, in folklore, and finding some easy and accessible ways to start to explore some ideas by just using a few creative tools, such as the carbon paper. And I find that extremely enjoyable, and also it's a real quick way to start to build up some studies and some sense of this spirit of the deer in your sketchbooks. So there's one option for you there. You may also, you may want to keep playing and exploring with this idea of these antlers and the shapes of the antlers onto this dark space. There is absolutely an invitation to do that. So I'll just pause for a second and reset, and then I'll come back and I shall give you a couple more options on that, okay? Okay, so we've got this idea of working with just the silhouette and sort of simplifying our deer into a sort of more folky style. And I'm actually itching to do some more antlers on here. I just love this working this light onto a dark surface, and we'll keep developing those dark surfaces as we go along. But to begin with, just this black ink is a really nice surface to work on. So let's have a look at a reindeer now, shall we? And in the stories that I've been looking at of the reindeer, well, this is sort of the typical reindeer, I'd say, of like the Sami tribe. It was always a white reindeer that was sacrificed to, in order to give an offering to the sun goddess, to beckon in the return of the sun. So actually this dark surface and working with light materials is a really good way to approach this reindeer. And again, if you're not feeling so confident, just use the carbon paper and trace down the outline and work it up in a really similar way to what we've done here. But we're just going to use that same technique that we did with the deer here, really, with the other deer, which is to sort of begin by just finding that inside shape. So here I'm just working just that sort of top line of the head and into the muzzle. And obviously as we blend, we can sort of start to find those shapes properly. But I just like this working from the inside space. It makes it a lot easier. It stops our brains from sort of glitching. And I'm sort of finding roughly the shape of the eye. I can always work that back out again, so don't worry about that too much. And pulling back, finding the shape of the ear. Just remembering with any drawing that it needs to go through a sort of ugly phase or a sort of disjointed phase before it starts to make sense. And that'll be the space where the antlers start to come out there. And again, we can move and reposition that eye. I'm just sort of putting it where I thought it was and sort of going from there. So I think these reindeer look a bit more like a sort of fluffy Highland cow, to be honest, than they do look like a deer that we might see here. And so just finding that shape again, that sort of silhouette of the deer. And it might look a bit strange at first, and just bear with, be patient. Again, it's that spirit of the deer that we're after. Blend. And again, if you haven't got a blender, just blend with your fingers. It works just as well. And just sort of noticing those edges of those shapes. In fact, I think that blending might be a little bit too much. Might do it with my hand instead, because it's going to be a little bit softer. And just thinking about how we worked the skull before, and sort of working this charcoal into the surface in a really similar way. Okay, so sort of a really rough, loose shape to begin with. Eye socket, ear, and we'll develop it on from here. So again, sort of aiming for these sort of spirity looking deer here. And now we can sort of reshape the mouth a little bit, really. We'll start to find that shape. I want to get a nice highlight around the eye. Let me just double check that my eye is close enough to the ear. It's a little bit hard to see because there's no dark on here just yet, but we'll just put in those antlers. Sort of again, just like we did before, just put in the loose shape of them to begin with. And we can sort of bump them up afterwards, because once you put one thing in, sort of helps you get the sense of the next. And in this area here, maybe we'll just make this like a little bit more furry. So a little bit more textured now that we've got that sort of white base. So we start to get that sense of this soft and fluffy deer. These are all just experiments, all right? So don't get into a place of perfection with this. We're just thinking about how we can record something that we're perhaps quite unfamiliar with, like the deer, but without getting too technical. So I actually quite like that as a starting point. Let's get some dark in there now. So I'm going to start to add a little bit of a slightly darker tone just to the top of the muzzle to find that shape, and to the top of the head. Again, just working that light and that dark. Really want to add a little bit more defined darkness around the ear, because that's looking a bit strange at the moment. I'm just wondering if maybe I need to move my ear back a little bit, but we'll see. I'm going to really get in that shape of the eye now. And maybe even just the nose down here. And then maybe even just run a few little marks. Just pulling back the neck a little bit more there because it looked a bit strange. So maybe just getting just a few more little marks around the eye, sort of starting to find that shape. Scribbling around the muzzle a little bit. And then we'll play that push and pull game between light and dark, just to get a little bit more texture into this spirited animal. Okay, so yeah, I'm going to move that ear just a little bit further back, I think. It's looking a little bit too close to the antlers. And that's the nice thing about this, is you can just adjust, push and pull. There we go. So I just need to do a little blow. And I really do want to get a highlight into that eye. I'm just going to make the eye a tiny, tiny bit bigger. So this one, I suppose, a bit less folk style, a bit more detailed. Let's get that little mark under the mouth in. Ooh, a moment of quiet when Ellie stops talking. So can you see how this sort of spirit of the deer is appearing here? Pop that highlight into the eye. Build up a little bit more white around the muzzle. And it just makes sense, doesn't it, to start with light and shadow. And find that shape of the ear. So a little something like that. Yeah, it's coming together now. Bit of patience. Bit of patience. I'm actually really liking how that's sort of come together now, how it's sort of starting to occupy the space. So not aiming for perfection here, we're just playing, exploring, we're keeping our materials nice and simple and just tuning in to the season. I always find if you put a few boundaries in place in terms of materials, it just makes things a bit easier at the beginning. And again, I'm going to run just a little bit more dark through that, so we start to get this dear mother appearing in the skies above. Isn't that lovely? So much fun. So yeah, and then you can go in and you can start to play and explore with these antlers again and find those shapes. I always find it's really nice to get the hard shape like that and then just soften it off with a little curve just to make it a little bit more organic. I could literally do antlers all day long. Find them really satisfying to draw. Keep seeing twigs on the floor and thinking they look like antlers. That's how much my brain has been tuned into this project all over Christmas. It's really hard once you get an idea in your mind to let it go a little bit. And again, I probably could have moved my ear back a little bit more, but you get the idea. We can either go for this really simple sort of pared back folky style, or we can go for something a little bit more spirited, a little bit more realistic, I suppose. They're both spirited, using exactly the same materials. And I'm sort of getting these visions of like dark night skies now, and these spirits of these animals starting to appear in those night skies, and that's quite exciting. Doesn't time fly when you're having fun? I really hope you enjoyed those first exercises of this first cycle of the season. And there are plenty more images on the resources that I provided for you. So if you want to continue to develop some studies based on those reindeer images, have a little play with some antlers, add those into your pages, you are more than welcome to. It is completely up to you. Or just hang around and I'll be back in cycle 2 and we'll continue to develop these sort of simplified approaches to capturing the spirit of the deer. So in cycle 2, you may need some watercolour paper. I just wanted to warn you. We're going to have a go at doing some darker backgrounds using a few different types of materials. We're also going to have a look at how we can simplify the full body of the deer and perhaps even start to place it into a landscape. We'll see how we go. But for now, just enjoy this slow, gentle start to the winter season, and I will be back in a couple of weeks with cycle 2. So much love.